Chapter 22. It Rattles a Man. I should have done more. That thought kept rolling around over and over in my head as I stood in the dusty parking lot of the Sunset truck stop. I'd seen Wallace and Savell outside the courthouse some 20 miles from here, and I'd trusted that Sheriff Collier would question them and find out what was going on. My priority at that time had been following up on the lead Mark Anthony had given me. Chasing around after Wallace within Greenville city limits hadn't been my job or jurisdiction. None of that mattered, however, as I stood here now, looking at a combination of clay, sand, and what I suspected was Wilson Turner's blood. The spot was right next to the tire tracks of the assailant's car. This had to be the work of Wallace. It just had to be. I'd offered as much to Potts, but he wasn't ready to name suspects just yet. This investigation was still new to him. I'd been pursuing John Wallace for years. I'd heard him threaten to kill Turner. I knew Wallace had done this. Potts and his brother, who was also his deputy, had questioned all the witnesses, including an elderly man from across the highway, and a woman who lived 2 lots over from the diner and gone back to their office. They were going to call the state crime lab to come and dust the truck for prints. They also asked Trooper Otwell if he would head back to Meriwether County. There were already reports coming in that the assailants had chased Turner through a construction site, even firing shots from the car. The commotion caused some of the men working on the road to focus in on the man hanging out the window shooting at Turner. A positive ID was possible. As for me, I walked over to an outdoor cooler, lifted a bottle of RC Cola out, and popped the top of the installed opener. I'd go in and pay before I left. I stepped over to an outdoor bench alongside the door of the diner and plopped down like a sack of flour. In one day, I'd appeared in court and been awarded an automobile, which I sold for nearly half a year's salary. I had an adrenaline rush from the Wallace-Savell sighting, talked to Collier, got an explosive tip, driven into the boonies to end up in a fight with Punk and Woodley, rushed 2 children to the foundation for treatment, contemplated murder, heard from God, realized that the missing Turner had been right under my nose at the Greenville jail, and then raced across the county line to discover that he'd been beaten. At the very least, I needed an RC and a minute or two to gather my wits. I pushed my Stetson back on my head, mopped my forehead with my handkerchief, and took a long draw off the cold bottle. Just then, Steve Smith, the owner of the diner and truck stop, let the screen door slap closed behind him. I reached in my pocket and flipped him a dime for the RC. He caught the coin in midair. He sat down on the bench beside me. "Well, this situation's killed my business for the rest of the day, that's for sure." He looked at me and tried to manage a chuckle, but neither one of us was in a laughing mood. "Your name's Miller, ain't it? Revenue from over Talbot County. I believe you've been in here to eat before." "I have," I answered. Then, holding the pop in my left hand, I leaned over and shook his with my right. "You kind of look like you're done in," he said. "You know anything about all this?" "More than I care to," I said. I said no more, and he realized I wasn't going to share any information. "What do you think of Potts?" he asked. "I only worked with him a couple times. He seems like a good lawman." "Yeah," Smith said. "Most folks around here think a lot of him." I drank some more RC. I was going to do something about Turner and Wallace. I just wasn't sure what. At the same time, I had the best tip I'd ever had on the location of Daniel Godfrey's still. We were quiet for a long time. Then Smith, staring blankly into the distance, spoke up. "It rattles a man," he said. "Man like you might get numb to it. Man in your business might get used to seeing things like what I saw today. I never seen nothing like it, I can tell you. Wish I hadn't seen it still." "I've seen some things," I said, "but I ain't used to it. I hope to the Lord I never get used to it." Steve shook his head for a long time. He was doing what good people do in these situations. He was playing it in his head. It would replay for a long time. It would never go fully away. "It was an awful thing they done to that boy," he said. "He fought. I tell you, he fought like a wild animal. But he wasn't no size. I wish now I'd done more, but I was so stunned I couldn't think." "Yeah, I know what you mean," I said, "about wishing you'd done more." He didn't seem to notice what I'd said. "That Ball fella, the one who claimed he was a god from the Greenville jail. He was in a rage, man, a rage like I'd never seen before. He wailed on that boy. First with a pistol, then—" Steve Smith, with his big, thick wrist and massive forearms resting on his apron, began to cry. He gathered himself again. "Then he took a sawed-off shotgun that other white-haired man was holding." A big bald-headed man and a man with white hair, I thought. That's Wallace and Savell, all right. Smith went on with the story that I didn't want to hear, but that I had to hear. "He took that shotgun, and he came overhanded like he was going to chop wood with it, and he brought them double barrels down on that boy's head. The boy was holding on to the sides and opened the car door, and he was screaming. Man, I mean, he was screaming, 'Somebody help me! Help me! They're going to kill me,' he says." Smith's voice broke again, and he wiped vigorously at his eyes with the corner of his white apron. "He had his feet up on the edge of the floorboard and was holding on with both hands on either side of the door, and they both couldn't get him in that car. But when he hit him with that shotgun, it went off, and Agent Miller, that boy went limp as a dish rag." I felt my throat start to burn, and I gritted my teeth. I suddenly saw Mrs. Turner all frantic in that kitchen of hers. She was still living in Wallace's sharecropper shack. Somebody'd have to tell her what happened to her husband. Somebody might have to protect her. Steve was bent over, elbows resting on his knees. His head kept shaking from side to side slowly, trying to get his mind around what he witnessed. I put my hand on his shoulder and squeezed. "It'll be hard for you for a long time. You just have to go on with your daily work. Keep living your life. Stay busy. The busier you are, the less time you'll have to replay what's going through your head right now." He looked over at me for a few seconds with what seemed to be relief and maybe appreciation in his eyes. "I've got to go," I said. "I'm not in this case, but I'm in another one that's related. I can work mine and maybe help find this boy, if he's alive somewhere." I stood up, put my Stetson on firmly, and took a few steps towards my car. I heard Smith speak up again. I didn't turn to face him this time. His voice suddenly sounded like a lost child's. "Agent Miller," he said weakly, "that Ball man, he jumped in the back seat on top of that boy. I didn't tell the sheriff this, I don't know why, maybe I was ashamed. But he jumped in on top of that boy, and the boy was in the floor all limp. The other man, the white-haired man, he ran around and drove out here screeching tires and all. And I looked up into that back window as they headed back to Meriwether County, and Agent Miller, that Ball man had that boy pulled over by his hair of his head, and he just wouldn't stop beating him with that pistol. I never saw such rage in a man. I never saw so much hate. He wailed on that poor limp boy all the way up the road, till I couldn't see him no more." He took a deep, ragged breath. He was trying not to sob. "Something like that, Agent Miller. It rattles a man." I looked down the highway and toward the Meriwether County line. All this trouble to move back there, across that imaginary line that bisected the pavement. It was a line I knew I had to cross, and trouble that I knew I'd get in the middle of. It was late afternoon, and the heat waves were shimmering off the pavement. The sun was still hot. "Yeah," I said, "I know what you mean."